Hi everyone, I'm Anthony Quinn. I'm the founder and CEO of Optic Intelligence, and I'm joined today by Roy Melnick from Financial Crime Risk Management Consultants based in South Africa. Today we're going to be talking about the impacts of COVID-19 and especially the impacts it's having in his region. So hi Roy, thanks ever so much for taking the time to catch up with me today, and I hope you're keeping well during these interesting times.
Thank you, Anthony. It's great being here, and thank you for the opportunity to speak about things that are very close to the heart at this point in time, and as you say, very challenging times.
And obviously, in just a few short weeks, we've all been forced to adapt to a huge amount of change. But I just wanted to understand what impacts you're seeing COVID-19 having on AML professionals.
We have seen a huge change in the way that people are operating right now, as we all have to be at home and find new ways of engaging and communicating. I think it's absolutely critical that organizations start relooking at their operating models. As you're aware, financial crime is only just one part of a business's operating model. So we're seeing massive changes in people having to reinvigorate the way that they do business and the way that they engage with each other, particularly around the financial crime matters.
It's obviously an interesting point that where businesses are really in crisis, that they are particularly vulnerable to financial crime with opportunistic activities from organised criminals. So I just wanted to understand, how do you think COVID-19 will impact and affect how businesses respond to financial crime threats that they're faced with?
I think, first of all, what we need to know and be aware of rather than know is that the people involved in illegal activity are going to use this to their advantage, of course, and that we need to be agile and able to respond to these matters. So it's not just the way that we onboard our customers, for instance, which is a key component of managing money laundering risk, for instance, but also the way that we respond, the way that we're able to manage our people, manage our process, manage our governance, manage our technology. These all need to change to accommodate a digital means of doing such.
So obviously, as we look to the future, there's a few things that jump out to me as becoming increasingly important. Obviously, one is kind of governance and oversight from boards. Second is really around conducting audit and assurance activities to assess the design and operational effectiveness of compliance programs. And probably the third thing is really enterprise risk assessments. So I just wanted to understand from your perspective the types of things that you think regulated businesses should be focused on.
Well, clearly governance is absolutely key in terms of what is being done by organizations, the way that they write their policies, their processes, the way they report to the boards of directors, the roles and responsibilities, the first, second, and third line of defense, but also the usage of technology, the ability to assess what you have put in place from a control environment perspective. So I see certainly there's a need for an uptick in conducting health checks within all the lines of defense within an organization, whether this be at the front line, by the oversight functions, or independently by the internal audit function. And for this, they would have to conduct risk assessments. Clearly, the environment is changing. We're seeing more reliance on digital identification and verification. So we need to be clear that our governance policies and processes can keep pace with that, and that the use of technology is used to bolster, those defences. And particularly what we have seen, Anthony, in the not too distant past, is we've certainly seen that organizations, regulated institutions, are using more and more health checks to be able to understand whether what they're putting in place is in fact effective as required. So there's a very real opportunity over here to conduct health checks and to make sure that risk assessments are conducted frequently.
I couldn't agree more with you, Roy. What we're seeing in our local market is obviously regulatory expectations changing in terms of the frequency of independent reviews, and we've seen a number of issues occurring where independent reviews might not have been done frequently, and so you're seeing issues pestering away for a long period of time. And obviously, under the kind of COVID arrangements, what we've seen is certain businesses closing down, so clubs and pubs, for example. And obviously, criminals that use that channel to launder funds are now looking to other businesses to launder those proceeds. So it actually heightens the risks of some other industry sectors that might have previously considered themselves to be lower risks. Obviously, the enterprise risk assessment becomes increasingly important. So I totally agree with what you just said there.
Responding to that as well, maybe, Anthony, is we've certainly seen an uptick in the regulatory environment on that, and we have seen changes to regulations requiring annual independent reviews of the operating environment in terms of health checks. So it becomes more increasingly important that we have experts who are able to go out and conduct these assessments independently, and that satisfies the requirements of the regulations.
And that's certainly something that seems much stronger in South Africa than it is in Australia, because even currently we don't even have a mandated audit or independent review requirement even every 2 years, let alone annually. So, I commend the local regulators for taking that step, and it's obviously important in detecting risks and vulnerabilities as early as possible.
Absolutely, I agree with that.
And as businesses look to take the steps that you just described, what sort of advice do you have for those companies?
My advice would be to relook at your governance processes, look at your policies, your procedures, your minimum standards. Be aware of the Financial Action Task Force guidance, for instance, around digitization, around digital identity, and so on, and have a look at how you can change the way that you're doing business to accommodate a lot more digital means right from the start. And then, one of the key consideration, of course, is communication, whether this be through your policies, your procedures, your messaging to your staff, the messaging to your stakeholders. All of this needs to change, into more digital means.
And just taking this to a local perspective from Africa, what sort of insights can you share about regulatory developments and the types of activity you're seeing in your local market?
So Anthony, we're seeing quite a big change to the way that regulators are responding in Africa as a collective. I'm pretty much sure that most people are aware that in December last year, South Africa was in fact subjected to a mutual evaluation by the Financial Action Task Force. First time in about 10 years. So, from that perspective, clearly, and in view of what is happening around the globe at the moment, I'm sure that there's going to be a lot more focus on remote workings and so on. So, although the inspection has been completed, we have yet to see the results of that. What we're also seeing in the region is that we're seeing that, for instance, Mozambique is going to be subject to a review by the Eastern and Southern African Anti-Money Laundering Group, which is a FATF regional body. So there's a lot of movement around in terms of that. In terms of the regulators themselves, we're seeing a lot more inspections taking place. We're seeing that countries are changing their laws and their regulations to accommodate independent risk assessments of their control environment to ensure that it is robust and effectively managed within these organizations. We've in fact seen this written into the laws of the various jurisdictions, such as Namibia, for instance. So we've seen this in Kenya. We've seen this in a couple of other countries, in the Eastern and Southern African environment.
In South Africa, do they have an annual compliance reporting requirement that businesses need to self-assess themselves? Because that has come into effect in Australia, and that's prompting businesses to sort of pause for thought.
I think it's more read between the lines, but when we come and do our review, we're going to check to see how often you are reviewing your changed circumstances when you issue new products and services and so on. That is definitely something that the regulators do look at, and to see whether there's any increased risk and whether you've actually been addressing any sort of increased risk that originates, say, from the acquisition of a new business in a new jurisdiction and so on. So I think it's more read between the lines, but also in the guidance, it does say you frequently need to assess your risk and make sure that it's aligned to the actual risk that your organisation poses, not only to your, in terms of your personal risk, but in terms of the risk within the country. In Kenya, for instance, in their regulations, they say annual reviews, independent, by the way, not so they almost need to, they need to reach out to somebody who's an external specialist in terms of doing that. They don't allow the internal auditors to do that, for instance.
Just before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience?
I think clearly again, I must re-emphasize the fact that that we need to be aware of the current times. We need to ensure that our businesses are in a position to act for protracted periods of time in a remote environment. That means we need to focus on our people, the processes that they have to follow, their roles and their responsibilities, as well as the means that we're able to train people given the changed circumstances to ensure that they remain on top of the changed environment.
Thanks ever so much, Roy, for your time. And that was really some really interesting insights there. And stay safe.
Thanks very much. Been good chatting to you.